All right. So yes, we are here today for an extended session about securing and protecting your content in Power BI. If you'd like a copy of these slides, where you can find them on my website is on coatesdatastrategies.com or coatesds.com for short on the presentations page, and you'll see a link to pop you down to the presentations page there. I focus mostly on governance, administration, security type of topics. I've stepped away from the development side of things, but I did that kind of stuff for a lot of years before focusing down here on the last few years. Here's our schedule for today. The times that I'm showing on the left are in Eastern time. So we're going to spend the first hour or so of our session on first some building blocks and then some of those really core pieces like workspaces and apps. And we're going to do some demos while we go along. The second part, if I jump down here, is going to expand on some of the concepts we talked about in part one and start taking some of those a little bit further. So we have two open Q&A parts here. Now, this is a webinar, so you will have to type your question in. Feel free to do that anytime. And what we're going to do is we're going to handle the questions that you have so far after the first part. Now, if it's something that I know I'm going to answer when we get to the second part, we'll just defer it because this session has very much a chicken and egg problem because everything builds upon each other. Midway, we're going to take a little bit of a break. You'll see a countdown timer when we get there. And then at the end, we'll do Q&A for about a half an hour, or if y'all take it easy on us, we will just wrap up earlier. All right, questions that we want to answer. This was basically all in the description of the session that you chose to join. I'm just putting it here for the future recording that this is kind of the scope of what we are trying to answer. Mostly, I am focusing on content creators here. There is a ton of stuff that we don't have time to cover. So just kind of want to mention that there are some security things that are out of scope for sure. I'm talking mostly today to the content creators or those self-service users who publish reports and data sets, and they take responsibility for setting and managing the security. That's really my prime target audience. Secondarily, people on the BI team or the center of excellence or the admins, the auditors, those people are all interested as well in how does security work. But I'm not really talking to the administrator type of person. I'm talking about what those self-service people are focusing on. So hopefully that helps in terms of scope and what we're able to fit in during this session. First, I want to cover some key concepts that are just really crucial to understand before we get into technical specifics. First, when we're talking about securing and protecting data, what exactly do we mean by that? And first, we're not talking about settings and roles first. No, first we are thinking about, do your users have guidance? Do they have training? Do they actually understand what is expected of them? And if that's a big gaping hole in what you're trying to do as you release Power BI in your organization, that's a big piece of the puzzle. The second piece of the puzzle is what I think of as right-sized permissions. That's really where we're focusing on today, all of these techniques that we can use. The third piece is information protection and data loss prevention. We're going to dip our toe in that just a little bit here today, but it's a concept all on its own. And I'll point you to some other resources that you can read about that. But that really is a complementary concept when it comes to security. This is a diagram that you can find on my website. We are not going to walk through this diagram, but through the course of today's conversation, we are going to touch on a whole bunch of these pieces. And I mentioned that it's available just because it's almost like a little reference for oh, okay, if I'm looking at a report, these are the things that I would be able to do, or a dashboard or an app, etc. There's also this that is more geared towards administrators. And I know I said that we're not focusing on them today. I don't have this published as a downloadable diagram on my website yet. I will get to that. But in the meantime, here's a screenshot of the other side of the story. If we're talking about the previous diagram being your self-service users and things they would usually focus on, and then here are things that your administrators would focus on, just to give you more of a 365-degree view of what are we talking about with security. So as you can see, it's a massive, massive topic. Let's talk about terminology just a minute, because you're going to hear me use terms like sharing, distribution, and collaboration as we go through this session. Sharing is one of those terms that we can use very literally or very generally. It is a specific feature in Power BI where we share out a report, for instance. If I'd have been giving this presentation a year ago, I would have said it's always read only. That's not true anymore. So watch out if someone says to you, I'll share that with you, because they might literally mean that, or they might mean that in more of a general way, and the technique, like a workspace role, for instance, right, is different from the sharing feature. So watch out for that term. Distribution is the general term for just, we want to deliver content for others in the organization to consume. And this is a term that I got directly from one of the product managers on the Power BI team. So this is how they see the world. And normally, if we're talking about app permissions, that is something that we say that's usually a good way to distribute content. We'll cover that more later. Collaboration is a general term for we've got people that are working together. Usually we say a workspace is where people are going to collaborate together. So those are a few terms. Next, I want to introduce you to this idea that we have layers of security. And first, that's a permissions for a collection of items. We have permissions for individual items, and then we have a bucket of other. So let me walk through what I mean by that. When I say collection of items or a set of items, we can do that two different ways, workspace roles and app permissions. And we're going to step through all of these in more detail. Those are where you really want to start, because you are invoking security for many things at once rather than one thing at a time. We've got individual items. So first, the visuals, our reports, our dashboards, our scorecards. Workbooks I listed here, but I crossed it out because workbooks don't actually have their own permissions. Reports now have charts within an individual report. The individual chart can be shared out. And underneath a scorecard, metrics have their own security as well. So you can see some of these are starting to drill a little bit deeper. Also, individual items, we've got the data layer. So our data sets, our data marts, data flows crossed out only because it doesn't have its own individual permissions that we can set. It always inherits them from the workspace. More on inheritance in a minute. And then we've got a variety of other items, things like row level security, etc. So we're going to touch on those a little bit more. At this point, what I want you to just be taking away is that we've got the collection of items and we've got the individual items. So inheritance, you're already familiar with this idea I'm about to share. Conceptually, think about what's on your laptop. You've got folders and files, and the folder, if you set permissions for a folder, that's a collection of items, or if you set permissions for the file, right? So conceptually, I'm talking about the exact same thing here. Starting with workspace roles, that's where we always start with security. And if we were to create an app associated with that workspace, the app sort of I'll explain what I mean by that in a bit, but it sort of inherits permissions from the workspace. And the individual items, those individual reports, those individual data sets, et cetera, they always, always, always inherit permissions from workspaces or apps. So your big takeaway for this that I want you to know is A, start thinking about this inheritance idea, and B, individual items can get their permissions one of several ways. And we're going to go through those ways throughout this session. What's not security? So things that we're not going to cover today, this idea of showing and hiding report pages, you can absolutely do it. And you can absolutely think of it as page level security. And there can be some clever logic, but it's not real security. If you send a user a URL to a hidden page and they have access to the report, they're going to be able to see it. It's just not quote unquote real security. Also, if they get the PBIX file, they're going to be able to open it. Same idea with perspectives. Those are a really nice convenience. And if you've got a content creator who's navigating the model, it can narrow down what they see. By the way, you can't create these in desktop. You do them in something like Tabular Editor. But again, they're not real security. So we're just going to shelve those and put those to the side. Now, the other core concept that I want to introduce is this idea of when do we need permission to an item. So let's say we want to view a report. So it's very obvious to us that we would need read permission for that report. Here's the deal. We also need read permission to the data set underneath the report in order for the data to be displayed on the report. So there's basically two levels of permissions here. When we go through our conversation in our demos, we're going to look at some things. And there's this idea that you can set the data set level permissions while you're, for instance, sharing a report. And there's different ways we can do things. Sometimes that stays what I would call tightly coupled. And sometimes it does not. And I'm going to show you a demo in a little while what I mean by that. But at this point, the takeaway that I want you to have is that two levels are needed. Sometimes they stay together and sometimes they do not. And that will get clarified for you as we move on. Another thing that I want to make sure you're thinking about as you're planning for security is who creates and manages the content. And this is something that we talk about a lot in the Power BI adoption roadmap. So I've got a link here for that particular page in the adoption roadmap. But this is a really important factor because whoever creates and manages the content needs permission to edit and publish. And this has a really big impact on how you'll set up security. And we'll talk about a few techniques about that, particularly workspace design. So we'll get to that. So we want to think about who's going to manage the content. We also want to think about who's consuming the content. So you might say, well, yes, Melissa, of course we need to think about who needs to view the content. And so again, from the adoption roadmap, we've got this notion of content delivery scope. And we've got these 4 scopes. So think about personal content. That's like a bicycle that's only meant for one person. And you start propping people up on your handlebars, for instance. Yeah, you can get away with it for a little while, but it's not designed for that. That's exactly the same thing as starting to share a lot of content out of your personal workspace. It's not meant for that. Team BI is about people that work closely together. So for instance, they might be able to share a car together. So here we're really usually talking about workspaces. Departmental BI we're talking about a larger number of people. The analogy of a tour bus is just because they usually have the same destination in mind. Enterprise BI is where we're crossing organizational boundaries. And the analogy of an airplane means that they might share a flight, but they have different destinations in mind. So that same content, they might do different things with it. So all of these things have correlations to how security is handled, of course. All right, a few more fundamental ideas before we jump into the first real topic. One is that when we're talking about self-service BI, there's a lot of stuff going on. And what we really need to do is think about balancing our user flexibility. We want to let people get things done. We want to also think about risk reduction and not being irresponsible with our data. And those two things can absolutely be at odds with each other. It's not easy. And the third is efficiency. If we ask people to do things that are really tedious and really inefficient, either they won't get done or things will be wrong. And that reduces our flexibility and our risk reduction. So you're going to hear me throughout the course of this session talk about how I'm not a fan of using the per item permissions for everything. That's not efficient, and that will increase your risk. So we'll clarify that as we go along. But think about these three aspects as you're coming up with what your governance guidelines are. Access control is our technical term for what are we trying to accomplish with our security here. We need to think about what it is that people really need, which takes us into the concept of principle of least privilege. And this is something we would all intuitively know whether we call it this or not. And really just, without making things harder than they need to be, what can I do to give person the minimum level of security, though, that will allow them to get things done and not prevent them from doing their job? So for instance, if you have 40 people that have a workspace administrator role, I say that's a problem because it's not following the principle of least privilege. And Power BI is a self-service BI platform. Conceptually, of course, we want everyone to use the data. Here's the thing though, when you start getting into your security policies, it's easy to go overboard and it's easy to lock everything down. We've already said principle of least privilege, right? So I just want to challenge you to think equally about two things: using the data and protecting the data. And can we value both of them equally? And I need to give credit to Laura here. She's got a great book called Disrupting Data Governance. If you're into this kind of thing, that's probably my favorite data governance book, and it's not boring, which in itself is a massive compliment, right? All right, where does information protection and data loss prevention fit in? For this, primarily, I am going to direct you to the Power BI implementation planning guidance. And let me just pop over there for a second. So you heard me a minute ago mention the Power BI adoption roadmap. There's also this thing called implementation planning that we have been working on. And one of the first sections that we released is information protection and data loss prevention. By the way, security is also all out. This was a beast to write. And these are pretty big articles, but it goes through tenant level planning, consumer planning, and content creator planning. So watch this space over the course of the next months. So as we build out this implementation planning, we've got a ton of subject areas that we're going to get to. You can see that we've basically only published the first few so far. So watch this space. When it comes to information protection, for Power BI, we're really talking about sensitivity labels. And so a sensitivity label is really just this thing where we classify content. So for instance, we say, this is highly confidential. And that should in turn correlate with some sort of internal policy that you have that tells people what you can and cannot do with that particular content. So it's not security per se, but it's certainly a very related topic. And then there's this idea of sensitive information types, and that's basically saying all of our data is not equal. And so certain types of data we need to treat much more carefully than others. So for instance, if you've got customer data in your Power BI data set, that particular data set then becomes a lot more sensitive. Hopefully none of you are putting things like bank accounts or credit cards in there, but sensitive data is something that we can start to identify and find it in the Power BI service. So let me just give you a couple quick ideas. We're not going to elaborate on information protection a lot, but I want to show you how in this particular workspace, I have sorted by sensitivity. So you can see that in a single workspace, I have got content that's at 3 different labels. So it's basically acknowledging that individual pieces of content can be more or less sensitive. And at the moment, we always set labels for individual items, not at a workspace level, although it would not be wrong to say, oh, if it's restricted or if it's highly restricted, we want to correlate those in the same workspace. That wouldn't be wrong. One thing I want to show you that's really interesting, I want to go over to my data hub. And if you're familiar with this, this is where our data sets and our data marts show up. The whole idea is for self-service report creators to be able to go to find existing data that they can use for creating their reports. And we'll talk more about data discovery a little bit later in this session. So the thing that I want to call your attention to is this data set right here that's called customer refund tracking. And in particular, do you see this little warning symbol right there? And if I hover on it, it says your organization has identified policy issues with this data set. Open it to take a look. And essentially what's happening here is this is something that's got refunds issued. And so there is a data loss prevention policy that's set up over in Microsoft 365. It's, excuse me, now called Microsoft Purview. Everything security and compliance these days is Purview. So there's a data loss prevention policy set up to say credit card information is not allowed in a data set. And so every time this data set, or I should say any data set, is refreshed or uploaded to the Power BI service, that policy is reviewed. And this one is saying it contains credit cards, that's not permitted. So this is also creating an alert for administrators, but it's also showing our users here that there's a problem. You can't have this kind of data. This functionality only works in premium, so capacity or PPU, but it does some really interesting things for sure. So that was just a couple ideas that you can do for information protection. So how it relates to security exactly. In the Power BI service right now, technically a sensitivity label is just that, it's a label, and it doesn't affect our access to content. It doesn't affect our true security that we're about to talk about. If you look at this release plan item, there's a little language that starts to tell me that's gonna change. And I don't have details behind it yet. Looks like it's coming soon. So this is something that we need to kind of watch this space. And I think that the sensitivity labels are going to affect security. So I want you to know to watch out for that. When we're talking about files like our desktop PBIX files or Excel files, et cetera, if we've set that label to be encrypted, you can't actually open the file unless you're in the proper group in the label policy, though. So that's a separate thing to manage. So it does absolutely actually put in another level of security. And then Defender for Cloud Apps, which is a different platform. It's part of Purview now as well. But what you can do is you can set up some actions based on your label to say, for instance, you cannot download a file that's set with, for instance, highly restricted label. That's kind of security. It's data loss prevention is what it is. But all of these things where security stops and ends gets a little fuzzy for sure. All right, so that was my foundational ideas information. I will let Mikhail or Mark stop me if there's any urgent questions that we need to answer. And otherwise, I'm going to move on to talk briefly about what or who we are actually going to set security for. And that is users, groups, and service principals. So at this point, I want you to be aware of a couple things. One, we already talked about it. We have these various ways to approach setting security, our collection of items, our one item, or our other, like row level security that we'll talk to later in part 2. And then also we have these different audiences or these different groups of users that are going to have different needs. So our data authors or our report authors, they're on the bottom left here. Those are our content creators or our authors. Those are the people that need to create content, so they need more permissions than the people on the bottom right, our content consumers that only need to view content. And our number of people increases as we go from left to right on the bottom of this page. So a lot of times we're kind of mixing and matching. What technique do we want to use with what type of user do I have and what their needs are? We can grant our permissions to either one individual person, a group, and there's 4 kinds of groups, or a service principal, which is all about automation. If you've heard the term Azure AD application, for purposes of this conversation, there is a technical difference, but Azure AD app and service principal are essentially the same thing. If you have one tenant, they are. So the top 2, we would be assigning to our content creators and our consumers based on whatever their needs are. And the bottom one is what we would be thinking about if we need to run some scheduled operations. So for instance, we want to check some APIs, pull some data every night, and save the file in our data lake, for instance. A service principal is ideal for those sort of unattended scheduled operations. So if we're thinking about groups and using groups, if I go back a second, right, here's another situation where this is a better way to manage security whenever we can versus one person for, all the obvious reasons, right? We set it once for the group as opposed to 200 individual people. So the kinds of groups that we might think about creating for Power BI, one is literally our security group. So what kind of security will I need to set for this segment of users? So maybe my finance users, for instance, might need their workspace access. We might need some groups for communication. So let's say we want to communicate from our center of excellence or our BI team that there is a new Power BI feature that we want our users to know about. Or we have some new Power BI training or new frequently asked questions, right? Just internal communication. And then we need to enable or disable features. And this is, we're talking about in the tenant settings of the Power BI admin portal, and we need some groups for that as well. So we like using groups rather than individuals because we can maintain it in one place. Theoretically, our accuracy is better, or we can fix it at least faster if it's not. And we can delegate managing members to a group owner. And I'm going to show you that in a demo here in a second. This is a link to the Power BI implementation planning where I wrote up the strategy for using groups. So that's a topic where rather than talking about that at length, I'm going to direct you to that particular page. There's lots of ways that you can use groups efficiently. We've got dynamic group membership. So that would be something like based on an attribute value. Think about everyone with an attribute of data analyst, for example, gets them into a Power BI community user group, and that gets them access to certain resources. Or group-based licensing assignment, everybody that's in a particular group turns around and gets a Power BI license. So this is something that's really, you can talk to your IT administrators about ideas for how do we improve our efficiency for how we correlate our groups and our security and our communication and all that good stuff. So let me show you quickly what a group owner looks like, because this is something that is really powerful in terms of managing something like Power BI. So I'm going to go in Azure Active Directory to the groups area, and I'm actually just going to go to my Power BI administrators group that I have set up. So if I go to members first, in my demo tenant, I have 3 members that are in my demo tenant. These are all just fake people and the email addresses don't work. But, well, they do. You won't reach me there though, because I don't pay any attention to them. The owners here is what I really wanted to focus on. I have 2 people that are assigned to be owners of this group. And as I talked a minute ago about the different ways we might use groups, think about this from, let's say you have someone in finance that maybe, it's not a great example because finance probably isn't huge, but any decentralized team inside of your organization where somebody could actually manage groups on their own, they could be set to be the group owner. And that's a really great way to get it out of IT and give it to somebody else who can responsibly manage it, react faster, get rid of help desk tickets, all that sort of thing. So this is really powerful. Those 4 different kinds of groups. So the 4 different ones, there's the 2 that really we would see used an awful lot are these 2 right here. The security group and the mail-enabled security group. There's also the Microsoft 365 group, also known as a Office 365 group. The distribution group, this is kind of a legacy concept. This last one, I would never set this one up new, only if you have an old one that does what you need. So those 2 middle ones, this is the one where, here's where it gets tricky. For Power BI permissions specifically, the Microsoft 365 group is really limited. There's a ton of stuff it can't do. So you get most settings that are actually supported if you use these 2 middle ones. So if we want to talk about this a little bit more during Q&A, somebody bring it up and we can visit that a little bit more. At this point, my main takeaway is if you're asking for a group to be created, know what kind of group that it is. Make sure you test that it does everything that you need it to do. So not every type of group works with every permission in Power BI. Some things need an email address. Specifically, the Microsoft 365 groups don't work, especially for per item sharing or for row level security. You can't set tenant settings for them. That has to be the security group. So figure out what kind of group you need and go from there. If you have existing groups for your org chart, they might work out of the gate for some things that you need to do, but you might need to ask for new groups that get created. Because when you start aligning what people need to do and the groups that already exist that were org chart related, it's not always going to work. So if You have to use IT. Try to see if you can get it to where, yeah, they'll create a new group for you, but they'll allow a decentralized person or team to manage it going forward so that you can move faster. Because here's the thing, you start implementing rules and you got to submit a help desk ticket and it takes 2 days for that thing to get responded to. People are going to find workarounds and they're not going to do the best practices and they're not going to do the things that you want them to do. So you got to find ways to move fast and react fast. When you start thinking about groups, you might end up with a lot of groups. So think about it this way. Let's say you had a workspace. We've got 4 roles, which we're about to talk about next. Say you want to assign a group for the workspace viewers and the contributors, et cetera. There's 4 groups right there. And then another group for your app viewers. There's 5 groups just for that one workspace. Take that times 3 as soon as you introduce dev, test, prod, although you don't necessarily need everything for dev and test. You get the idea. This is a planning exercise. You almost end up with a matrix of planning out the groups. All right. Workspace roles. This is our first core fundamental topic, our workspace roles. We have 2 types of workspaces. We've got the idea of a personal workspace or my workspace. Everybody has one, even the free users. No, my workspace can never be disabled, and it only has 1 owner compared to a standard workspace that has 4 roles. Now, there is a really new feature that allows a Power BI administrator to get access to a personal workspace. And when they do that, they can get access for up to 24 hours. So my recommendation is still the same, that because only 1 person owns and manages this content, you do not want mission critical content shared out of a personal workspace. This ability for a Power BI administrator to go in and help in case of a problem is not to be used, constantly. And that access gets automatically revoked after 24 hours. So for that reason, we're going to focus primarily on the standard workspace, the one with the 4 roles. So let's think for a second here. Before we think about those roles, what's our actual purpose for a workspace anyways? Well, it's to store content. So here, I've got a bunch of, data sets and reports, et cetera. So, okay, sure, I need to store my content, but it's more than that. Another primary purpose is collaboration. So we might have that data model owner that's working with a report owner, and they're both creating and publishing content. And I know all of you have dedicated data validation and QA people that are doing formal testing, and all that kind of stuff can happen in a workspace. Number 3, content distribution for very small informal teams. So let's say you've got a few viewers. Maybe you've got, a couple managers on your team that want to go and view content. You might say that we don't need a Power BI app that's more stuff than we need. We want to keep it simple. So for very small teams, informal needs, it's absolutely okay to use a workspace. So let's go look at those roles here for a second. And if I pop over to Power BI and we go to my sales analytics workspace, and I'm going to go up here to the access menu. And the first thing that I want to point out is that I have got, for each one of the 4 permissions or the 4 roles, I have a group assigned. So you can see I called it Power BI content admins, contributors, members, and then, sales is the suffix for the group name because the topic or the purpose for the workspace is sales analytics. So this is something that sometimes is easy to accomplish, and sometimes in some organizations is really brutal to accomplish. But those 4 roles are then affecting everything that lives in this workspace. And that's a really important concept as we march towards which thing to use when. So our 4 roles: viewer, contributor, member, admin. The viewer, who are we targeting to? Those report consumers. So the purpose, distributing content for your small teams. The other roles are really meant for content creators and admins. Those are the people that are collaborating. So these other 3 roles basically have edit permissions on the content. And I'm not going to go through exactly what each role has. That's all really well documented by Microsoft. But it staggers, right? A member can do more than a contributor and all that kind of stuff. But really what I want you to be thinking about is this is targeted to my content creators. And then this is really targeted to my content admins. So that means back to the whole different groups of users, and the workspace roles are inherited by everything else. So they're fundamentally really important to get right. And this ability to support your different groups of users starts with how we design and organize our workspaces. So let me explain. On the left, I've got 2 data workspaces. So the first one I've got, it's where I'd put my data flows. And the second one, I would put my data sets. And then on the right is my reporting workspace. And if you've heard people talk about decoupling your reports and your data sets, this is exactly what I'm talking about. But guess why this works really well? If you have different people who create reports versus the people who create and manage data sets, this supports that. So if you've got everything all in one workspace and you tell your report creators, don't touch the data set, and you're basically relying on the honor system, we can do better than that. And so this does introduce extra complexity. Sure, it introduces more workspaces, but it does set us up to be able to handle our security in a better way. So those data authors, the people creating our data sets, our data flows, our data marts, what we would do for them if we were separating our data workspaces and our report workspaces, we would give them the workspace role up here on the data workspace. They would get the workspace role of admin member or contributor. Or, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the data set section down in part 2, there's a new write permission on the individual data set. And so we'll talk about when that's appropriate. So your data authors would get permission at the workspace level where the data lives. Your report authors, so the people that are publishing down here, they would only get the build permission on the data set. And so that means I can read the data and I can build new content from it. And they would get a workspace role only down here where they need to publish their content. There is no individual write permission for reports like there is for data sets. So our report creators are definitely talking about a workspace role. From a security perspective, this gives us clarity on who may edit versus view, right? And we're not relying on the honor system. And bingo, if the people that are creating a report down here actually need row level security to work on the data set, meaning, we'll talk more about this later, but meaning that the same data set, if I run it, I might only get the West Coast data and somebody else runs it, they might get the East Coast data. If you're currently publishing multiple data sets to accomplish that, you can simplify and accomplish that with row level security instead. And row level security will work for your report authors in this situation because they only have read plus view on the data set. I'm actually going to change this slide really fast. Oh no, I lost my place. See, Mark, now I gave you something you got to fix in the, I'm going to fix this. Read plus build. There we go. That's a little bit more accurate. Whereas if it was all in the same workspace, row level security would be thrown out the window if they have any sort of edit permissions on the content. It's just ignored, and that's by design, and we'll talk about why later. I'm not going to go through this whole list of workspace planning criteria. I've got a blog post. The full link is down here at the bottom left. There's essentially, and there's more to it, there's essentially a checklist of what are the kinds of things you want to think about when you're planning for your workspaces. But security and how you're going to distribute it, how you're going to manage it is very important pieces of the whole workspace planning aspect. Now, there are two exceptions I want you to know about to what your content creators can expect if they have contributor or member permissions. One is there is a setting inside the workspace. So if I pop back over here and I go to settings and I expand advanced, there's this setting way down here to say, allow contributors to update the app for this workspace. That gives contributors just one more thing they can do. So they're still not a full member, but they can do one more thing. So that's a bit of an exception that will change their behavior for that one workspace only. There's this other tenant setting, though, that affects everything across the whole tenant. And what this does, if it's called block republish and disable package refresh, which is a very strange name, essentially it means only the dataset owner can publish updates. Now, this is a speed bump because if you have permission in the workspace, you can go and take over the dataset. But the by default, you can't overwrite the data set. My position is, we don't need this if we structure our workspaces well with security in mind. And the big reason why I don't like this is because it's not workspace by workspace. It affects everything in the whole tenant. And as soon as you got to go take over a data set, you got to reset permissions, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a hassle. All right, a couple things to watch out for as we wrap up this section. No mission critical content in personal workspaces. Personal workspaces only have the one owner, so only use them for things like learning, temporary work, etc. Too many people that can edit content in a workspace means too much risk. Also, workspaces that are really broadly defined, like one workspace for the entire sales team, and it has all these different subject areas, maybe it works. If you have a really broad workspace topic-wise, it probably means you're doing more per item permissions. The build permission is automatically granted when we do sharing. So we'll see that in demos later. So watch out for that, because a lot of times you don't need to grant the build permission for people that only need to read the data. So it over provisions in some cases. And we talked about this a minute ago, how row level security is ignored for anyone who has edit permissions on the data set. Hence, we can structure the workspaces to handle that. Okay, one more topic before we open it up for Q&A and then go to our break. And this is app permissions. So here, I'm just going to call it a Power BI app. I've noticed recently the Power BI team has started calling it Power BI Organizational App. So this is the app that comes, there's one per workspace, and essentially this is your best technique for more broad content distribution scenarios. It's more formal because it packages up content really nicely. We have one app per workspace. So let's say here on the left, we've got a workspace with 4 reports. And on the right, notice that I've got an app, and I've chosen to include 2 of those reports in the app, plus a link. And I'll show you what that looks like in a demo in a second. And the idea behind this is that we're packaging up 2 of those 4 reports for our view-only consumers. People that get access to an app is always just a view-only situation because your authors get access through the workspace. Workspace roles are sort of inherited, and I say that because everyone who has any kind of workspace access, any of those 4 roles, automatically has access to the app. So they're automatically viewers. Here's a really important concept, and that is that permissions and content are always deployed together. Let's say you have been working on report number 2. And when you are ready to publish, the content and the permissions are always deployed together. This is a great reason to use groups. So what we can't do is say, I don't want to touch the permissions, I only want to update the content. And we can't only update permissions, hence using groups. A fairly new piece of apps is this idea of audiences. So let's say I've got 3 items here in my app. I've got my 2 reports and I've got my link. Let's say audience 1 gets to view all 3 of those items and audience 2 gets to view 2 of those 3 items. My audiences can do that, and it's a fantastic functionality if you haven't tried it out yet. So let me show you what that looks like. We are going to go to the app for this particular workspace. And on the setup page, I've got nothing here that I want to call out really other than there's a checkbox to allow users to make a copy of reports in this app. This is something that I would want you to think carefully about because it lets people that are otherwise viewers, right? Apps are always view only. It lets them become content creators starting from what you released in the app. And the concern that I have with that is if you have branded things on the reports in those apps to say, oh, this was maybe certified or verified by your BI team or updated by the COE, right? Any of that kind of stuff, you start letting people be able to do this, you break it. So I prefer, it's more work, but I prefer to release a template for people separately so that we can have just a little bit more control over who does what. All right, so under the content, here I've got a section called profitability, and I've got a report called gross margin analysis, just a simple little kind of sort of ugly report. I've got 3 reports here, and then I've got a sales KPIs page, which if I edit the link, it's really just going to a SharePoint page that documents my sales KPIs. It's meant to accompany the content that's here. So 3 reports and a link is here under content. So here's the interesting part from a security perspective. Audiences here is where we're setting our security. So I am in the sales leadership audience. I am letting the sales leadership see everything. And notice over here, workspace users is listed. That means my workspace users are all inherited by the app. I've got 2 individuals and I've got 2 sales leadership groups that are being granted access via the sales leadership audience. Now, if I go to the sales reps audience, I get this message in the middle because the gross margin is being hidden for sales reps. So if you have ever in the past separated multiple workspaces just so you could have 2 apps with different stuff for different people, and then you were publishing the same content to multiple workspaces, this solves that problem. And then down here, you can see that I've got a couple of different groups and so forth. So essentially, this lets you mix and match your content and your audience who gets to view it. And that's really helpful functionality. Now, Couple things that you want to watch out for. One of the benefits that is frequently cited for an app is that, oh, if you're messing around with the report over here in the workspace, they don't see it in the app until you republish. That is indeed true. However, every single change you ever make to the data set always takes effect immediately, which means you can break your reports in the app if you do breaking changes in the data set. So we have to be really careful with what we actually let change in the workspace versus the app. So what I've shown here can be, if you're careful about it, a really lightweight way to do dev, test, and prod. As soon as you outgrow this is when you start going to separate workspaces for dev, test, and prod. But if you're careful, it's a lightweight way to do that. Again, you've heard me say the permissions and the content are published at the same time. The one mitigation is to use groups instead of users, which means you never have to republish the app just to change who's in your audience. You go add them to the group. And bonus, if you're a group owner, you can do it fast and easy and get it done fast. And then there is one exception, and that is over here. If I go to, yep, I can discard that. If I go to my apps menu, and I'll use executive bonuses just for fun. We're going to look at this again that when we talk about the request access workflow. But there is, if Scotty got sent this link from someone to the app, he doesn't have access, so he requests access. We'll talk more about that after our break. It shows up here in pending requests. If I approve this, this is, as far as I'm aware, the only exception to the permission change is made, but the content in the workspace is not republished. So that's your one exception to otherwise this general rule about permissions and content always kind of being coupled together. That audience, you know how I showed you the 3 reports and the link? Let's say a new report is added to the workspace. They don't get into an audience by default. You have to literally go and add it to each individual audience for them to see something new. And that's actually good. Okay. We are ready to handle our first open Q&A. So I'd like to remind you, if we can try to keep the scope of the questions mostly around things like workspaces, apps, or our building blocks, all of the other concepts that are listed here, we're going to get to. So I suspect that I would answer at least some of the questions as we go along in part 2. So Miguel, Mark, what do we have to tackle at the moment?
We have a number of 9 questions. So I was thinking that you would be the best to determine if you need to answer it now or if that will be answered later.
Okay.
We're just going to ask the questions right out. So Mark, do you do the first one?
I will. First question. Is there an out-of-box way to audit permissions in the PBI service, i.e. who has access and what level to all those objects? And that's from Nico.
Yeah, let's do this. I have a bunch of content on auditing for who has access to what. During our break, I'll go find that. And then what we'll do is in the second Q&A, I will take a minute. I've jotted that down, and I'll take a minute to show you, I'll point you to the 2 or 3 APIs that you're probably going to be most interested in for that particular item. So I'll pull that during the break.
Srinivas is asking, is it possible to build a report with multiple published reports with different data sources? Can we achieve this using data marts or any other solution we can approach?
You wouldn't need a data mart for that. So if I'm understanding you correctly, so with a question like that, I'm not quite sure whether or not to read data source literally or not. But let's say I've got, it's going to be ugly, but so let's say I've got data source 1, 2, and 3, and we'll say a couple databases in a file, doesn't matter what they are. So the first thing that we could possibly do is literally just integrate them into one single data set, right? And then that single data set can then serve many different reports. And so that's one option. The other option is, in fact, let me just change colors here. The other option is, let's say I've got data set 1 and we'll say data set 2. And maybe 2 sources go to 1 and another source goes to 2. And so then, you know, your next option is to say, well, do I want a composite model? And so essentially that is another data set that brings together the data from those. So there's a bunch of different ways that you could architect that. So the short answer is yes. You mentioned data mart. I would say the best use case for a data mart is when you want to use Power Query Online to send your data to not only a data set, but also to a relational database because you want to write SQL queries. If that isn't your prime #1 use case, data mart isn't really what you should be thinking about. You should be more thinking about, well, let me map up my data sources and my data sets. How do I integrate them and how do I report on them? Because yeah, there's a bunch of different ways you can mix and match all this stuff. So I would encourage you maybe to look at, if I go back to under Power BI implementation planning, we have started releasing, we've called them usage scenarios. And the idea is to give you ideas on how you do put all these Lego blocks together. So for instance, managed self-service BI is about using one shared data set for reports across a bunch of different workspaces. There's a couple of them here on self-service data preparation and advanced data preparation that are mostly focused on how do I use data flows and then send the data to multiple data sets. So you might kind of poke around these and see if you get some ideas for those building blocks as well.
We move on to Akshatar's question. Currently, we have data export enabled only for a few AD groups. Long term, it's difficult to keep this approach. What security concerns should we be worried about if we choose to enable data export for everyone?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is, if I pop over here and we go into the tenant settings. And so the export settings have gotten a lot more granular than they used to be. So now we've got, export to Excel is separate from, downloading the PBIX, separate from exporting to PowerPoint, which can now be live or point in time, kind of a snapshot. So they're a lot more granular. So from the question, I don't know quite what you're talking about for sure, but exports are always a concern when, well, let me back up a second. Exports are fine if you literally want a point in time snapshot as of, say, the end of the month. And, maybe for auditing purposes, or even just ease of use later for comparison, because you want to be able to quickly check. And then you also want to think about where those are saved. So guidelines for if we're exporting and saving content from the Power BI service, where do we want people to save it? Because suddenly, guess what? If they can access it that way, people that we didn't intend to ever see it because of how we set security in the service can now see it. So all those kinds of concerns about why are we doing exports and where are we going to save it? And then I also wouldn't want to be using exports if it's literally just to be used as a data source for something else, right? There's better ways to do that. So There's only so many hours in the day, so maybe we can't fix everything. But those are the kinds of things that are top of mind for things to worry about. But if you prevent exports entirely, sometimes people will find other ways. So I usually advise, try to watch your activity log for people that appear to be overusing exports, and then contact them in a really, and now I'm talking more to administrators, right? But contact them in a really productive way to say, we can maybe help you with efficiency or better ways to get this done.
Perfect. So Anthony has the question, what is the best way to give build permissions to a report dataset when sharing a report?
Hold on to that thought. In part 2, we are going to be talking about dataset permissions, and build is going to come right along with that. So hang on to that. And if we didn't cover it to your satisfaction, bring it up again at the end for me.
If we move on to Shinkar's question, do you recommend having groups by content, workspaces, app, or report?
Hold that because we're going to, after I introduce all these different pieces, so we've touched workspace roles, we've touched app permissions. My goal is at the end, I give you, here's the rule of thumb, and you can always break the rule of thumb, but kind of start here. So if you're able to stick around to the end, that I intend to answer.
Okay, so Matt asked quite a good question. If I'm trying to share to external customers, he says under 100 here, and each customer has multiple users to be shared with, how would we create groups for each of these customers while also sharing with internal groups?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because you probably want to have dedicated groups for the external users versus your internal users, but that's not a hard and fast rule. I would say it depends on how common external users are in your organization. So I tend to say if they're really unusual and it's almost like an exception that you're letting an external user have access to your Power BI environment, treat it as such, right? With whatever extra needs to go along with it. If it's really, really common, then combining groups wouldn't be the worst thing. Again, that probably comes down to, how about you audit your groups every 90 or 120 days, have somebody literally review the list and say, yep, everybody here should still have access. Easier said than done, I know.
We have 2 questions that I'm trying to make as one. It's Nico and Jennifer that wonders a combination of what kind of levels of permissions are required for analyze in Excel. Is there a way to allow users to access the data via Excel using get data without making them contributors in the workspace?
Yeah. Hang on to that one, because that comes along with the build permission.
Okay.
But the answer is the build permission.
and also that applies when the data set and the reports are decoupled in different workspaces. It
would still apply, and give you even more flexibility. Yeah. But yeah, then yes, we're managing the build permission on a data set by data set level. The build permission is implicitly granted to anyone with contributor, member, or admin permissions at the workspace level. So we're waiting eagerly.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand this question, so hopefully you do. For separate workspaces, if you're trying to have a separate workspace for each department in the company, is there an easier way to split these without having a x to the power of 2 result?
So first of all, I don't love the idea of trying to align workspaces with departments. So rather than take up a bunch of time here, I would say take a look at the workspaces content that we published not too long ago. So there's some tenant level planning considerations, got some naming conventions, et cetera, et cetera. Somewhere in here, I know I talked about where it breaks down logically of trying to say, let's use one workspace for department. So workspace level planning, that page, this is probably where purpose, ownership, organization, this is probably where you'll get enough ideas to say, okay, will it then really work? Because what you're essentially trying to do is align with your org chart. That might work initially for a while. As soon as you've got dozens of items in the workspace, we don't have folders, right? So having workspace for that department. The other reason that I don't like it is that it implies, okay, the operations department, this is their workspace. Are you implying that operations is who owns and manages it? And lots of other people might have access one way or another to that content. You see what I'm driving at, right? It doesn't, is it implying who owns and manages it, or is it implying who consumes it, or both? And as soon as you start breaking all that, then the name is kind of useless. So that's why I really like focusing more on purpose. To be fair, in large organizations, when you do that, that does mean you'll have even more workspaces because they're more granular.
Cool. Samuel asks you to reiterate the part where you say there's something you can do that will stop you from republishing an app every time new content is added.
Stop you from, I think what he's talking about, if I go back to my app, so so there was 3 reports here and a 4th link, right? So let's say a brand new report was added to the workspace. It will never automatically show up here. You will always have to go to add content. And actually, rather than the drop down, just click the button and choose the thing that's there. So it's not a setting you have to set. It's just the new default behavior. It used to be before audiences, the little yes, no include in the app, yes or no was yes yes was the default. And then you could accidentally have something new sneak in if you weren't careful with looking at that. So this is much more methodical, even though it's a little bit more of a hassle that you would have to go touch it. All right, do we want to do maybe one more question and then we will do our break?
Yes, sounds like a good idea. So from Eben, we've got a statement and then the question. So recommended approach is to separate data sets and reports. Suppose data sets and report workspace is managed by IT. After giving build permission on data sets to regular users, what would be the best place to publish self-service report created by users? Is it existing report workspace, or should we create a separate workspace for user created reports?
Ah, yes. So I, in that case, would probably lean towards the separate workspace for user created reports so that the right people can have the workspace roles assigned. And then that way, you are certain that who is able to read content in the IT managed workspaces, read plus build in some cases versus manage the content. So for instance, here I've got a sales data workspace, but then I've got other reporting workspaces for sales analytics, quarterly bonus tracking, sales reconciliations. And that's all because the topic is a little different and the permissions are a little different, even though they're all oriented towards sales. And then one way you can help bridge that, because yes, it is more workspaces. You see, I've got the same icon assigned to each one. It's got the same sales prefix to help group them together. But yeah, I like the idea of separating them out within reason. All right. So we've been through the workspace roles and the app permissions, our two collection of items, ways to set permissions, to go back to our first thing that we went through about the levels of security. So now we're going to start diving into some more specifics, starting with per item permissions. The goal here is setting security for one individual item. And I used to refer to this as being equivalent to the sharing feature in Power BI. For the most part, that's still true, that you can say the sharing feature equates to the notion of per item permissions. The term sharing has started to become a little bit broader, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that as we go along. But we've got these individual items, or artifacts, as they're sometimes called. All of them, except for workbooks and data flows, have their own manage permissions settings, and they're also always inherited from workspace roles and app permissions as well. So if you set them here, it would be additive. Or another way I tend to talk about it is if you don't have access to the entire workspace, but you give somebody access to one report in the workspace, that would be an exception to workspace roles, is another way I tend to like to look at it. So when we're setting items specifically, and I'm going to start with reports, and then in our next topic, we will get into data sets. But let's start with reports, because those are a little bit easier in some respects. And there are two ways that we do sharing of reports. One is links, and the other one is direct access. So let me start with the one on the right. The direct access we've had forever. That's the one that we can assign to users or groups. And that's the one that has a much longer history. As of mid-2021, though, links, as shown on the left here, is what is now the default. And the whole goal for them making the links the default is because now it aligns with Office and SharePoint and what that experience looks like. So I'm going to show you a demo here in a moment. If we're setting a link, we would do so three different ways: the people in your organization, specific people, and groups, or people with existing access. So I'm going to talk about those three more in just a moment when we do our demo. Now, the other thing that's really interesting, there's also chart level sharing that has come about. So if you can imagine, we've got a report, let's say there's 4 charts on it. There's now a menu item to where you can actually share just that one chart. And so that initiates what's called a shared view. And it only works for the people with existing access. So if I go back here for a second, that's the thing at the bottom here. This one, we don't actually set new permissions for the one little itty bitty item on the report. It does follow the report level permissions. So I'll borrow a quote from Guy in a Cube. Let me move over into our machine and talk about it more this way. All right. When we're talking about sharing, I actually want to start with back in my own personal workspace. Because where do most brand new users start? They start here, and they also start predominantly with sharing because it is the very first icon that they run into on the user interface. And it's also very prominently displayed for any individual report or dashboard once you've got it open. So let's say I've got something like this product sales preliminary analysis. And if I go to the menu and I look at manage permissions, I being Peyton, this is my demo environment, I have shared this with Sadie and given Sadie read permissions. It's my workspace. And so read and reshare would be the only permissions that I can give her. I can't let her edit it over here. So this is actually a good example of sharing from my workspace, some preliminary analysis that I want my coworker to see. Now, a bad example of sharing from my workspace, if I go to this Southeast Sales Division monthly totals, I have given the entire sales and marketing department read and reshare permission. That's the kind of thing that makes me go, not a good choice. This particular Southeast Sales Division thing should live in a full-fledged workspace. All right, so let's switch over to my sales analytics workspace. And we said a moment ago that users first run into this little sharing button very quickly in their journey. So let's see what's there. This is that link experience that we said is a default now. And so we get this little send link dialog box, and guess what the default is? These are those three choices that we said we had. Now, this is coming up for me because I have permission in the tenant setting. This is, I kid you not, everyone in your organization can now, if you hit share, didn't change anything, and just hit apply, everyone in your organization can now read and reshare this report. I don't say this very often, but this is a bad default. This is overly permissioning by default. What the default should be is this: specific people and groups. It should ask you by default who it should be. So the people in your organization can be disabled in the tenant settings. I recommend doing that so that then the default becomes the specific people. And it just means people have to choose who they're sharing with. And I think that's a reasonable thing to ask. So hopefully this behavior will change at some point. This is what it is now. This notion of reshare is also on by default. That means whoever has read access also has the ability to freely decide who else should be able to read it. The control freak in me doesn't love that default either. So you might consider more often than not disabling that. Now, not added by default, here is a build content with the data associated with this report. So we're going to talk more about this here shortly, but if I were giving someone read permission to this call center stats report, they also have to have read permission on the data set. When I create this link, it's doing both. You can optionally also add the build. And so the idea here is when you're adding build, and we'll talk more about this when we get to data sets in the next topic, but think about it this way. The person who needs to read the report is a report consumer. Are they also a report creator? And if so, allowing build would be appropriate. And if they're not, then don't. Okay, so that's our link experience. What I want to do is I hopped out of there. I'm going to go to the report. I'm going to go to manage permissions. Now, here's a link that already exists. It has read and reshare that's granted for these three people. Now, if we just kind of see our 4 menu options here, there's also direct access. Here's where we get to really clearly see that the admin, the member, the contributor, the viewer, here's who is inheriting permissions to this individual report from the workspace level. And it used to say something a little bit different. They made it much more clear a few months ago, which I was, tickled pink to see that. So this shows our direct access at the moment. These are all inherited by the workspace. Here's also some pending requests. We're going to do one of those here in just a second when we get to talk about the request access workflow. So we're going to come back to this one, and we're going to also look at these shared views here in a second. Those are a little bit of an odd duck for sure. So let's go back to the links. So we can also add a link from inside here, and it's basically the same experience as when I hit that icon a little bit before. So I'm going to just go ahead and in fact, hang on, let me close this. I want to really illustrate this. I'm going to do add link, and I am just going to then, I've done nothing. I'm going to choose copy link down here. That just happened. Like, it did not ask me, it didn't double check. So you can see how much I dislike this default. So here now we've created, everybody in the organization can view this report. So you already heard me say disable it in the tenant settings. The other thing you can do is when you have row level security implemented, that is your second layer of defense. So in this case, we're going to talk more about row level security before the end of this session. But what would happen in this case is if they aren't in row level security, they can get to the report, but they can't see any data. So it's a second level of defense. It's not a great user experience, but it does give you some extra satisfaction if for whatever reason you can't just disable this. All right, so I'm gonna delete this because I don't want it, and it makes a couple things a little kooky for my demo. All right, so I'm going to go back. I'm going to do another little link. I'm going to choose what really should be used most of the time, a specific person. And I'm going to go ahead and say apply. Sadie, my coworker, is who I want. And we're going to go ahead, and I could add a little message if I wanted to, but we can go ahead and hit send. Okay, so now if I refresh this page, okay, I actually didn't intend to do that, but this is a really good thing. What just happened is because I didn't unclick, Sadie got added to the existing link. So now I had intended to deselect that. So what I want to do is I'm going to try that again, and I'm going to remove Sadie from that. And let me do this again. I'm going to unshare. Sadie? Yep, send. And she gets a different link. Okay, so here's where things get interesting. So let me do this one more time. I'm going to do specific people. I'm going to unclick the share. And this time I'm going to choose Griffin. Now, here's something that's really interesting. Griffin is participating in 2 links, or has permission, one with read and reshare and one with read. If either one of these links was sent to Griffin, either one will work. The other thing that's really interesting, this middle link here is, who's this one? That is Edward. This second link is only read and not reshare. What do you think will happen if somebody were to send, like Sadie, if she sends that link over to Edward? If we were in the room, I'd see some of you nod. What would happen is it would work. And here's why. The read reshare link is more permissions than this second link that is only read. So either one of them will work for Griffin. But Sadie, if she got sent this link, which is read and reshare, she only has permission to read. So the opposite would not work for her, if that makes sense. So that is a way that makes it so that as users share links around, it makes it a little bit easier. So don't take it as absolute that if we look at manage access for this, that Edward could only use this link. Technically, he could use this one too, because it has fewer privileges. All right. So let's pop back out here and let me look at, let's do gross margin analysis. My ugly little report. Up here at the top right of the chart is this little menu, and it's got, I'll make this a little bigger for you. It's got a share menu. And when it flies out, we've got several different ways to share. So from the bottom, we've got the open in PowerPoint, which is fairly new functionality. That's all really interesting. We've got the chat in Teams, where we can send a link in Teams. We've also got the link to selection, which is the one I want to focus on for the moment. So if I click copy, because it's a chart inside of a report, it's not going to grant new permissions just for the individual chart. It's just generating a link. But here's the interesting part. If I go back to gross margin analysis and I look at manage permissions and I go to shared views, this is where some of these shared views start coming into play. So if I click this link, here's the one, I'll do this one. Here's the one, 2:56 p.m. that I just did. I'll click line chart. It'll pop a new window and it'll go straight to that individual chart. And if I had a bunch of them on the page, it would highlight just that one little chart. So here's the weird thing though about these shared views is that they expire. So these are just really meant for temporary collaborative purposes. This is not to be used for, permanent replacement for report level sharing. All right. Now, under direct access, so we talked about all of our inherited workspace permissions. If I want to add, and we'll use Griffin just for fun, here's the thing. Remember on the link, the reshare was checked by default, but the build was not? Look how direct access has both of them checked by default. Reshare, build, and send an email. So kind of watch out for that. Direct access is just a little bit more excitable about how much access that it wants to give. All right. So per item sharing, we just looked at the links, we looked at the direct access, and when do we actually want to use this? If you want to provide read-only access to one and only one item, and that would be because you don't want them to see everything in the workspace, or you don't want them to see everything in the app. This one item is an exception, which is okay to do when you're doing so purposefully. It's not as good of an idea when absolutely everything is done this way. right? It's much, much more tedious to maintain all of these individual items versus the workspace roles or the app permissions. Now, sharing from your own personal workspace is okay with, again, access to one and only one item because it's non-critical, temporary kind of a thing, and you're using it sparingly, not overusing sharing from my workspace. So we have the two permissions for a report. We have read and reshare. So both of these target the consumer. So for reports, you always need to use workspace roles if you are targeting the authors, because the individual item report permissions are always read-only. So watch out for, the overuse. This is people just getting started with Power BI don't know any better. So a lot of times this just becomes out of hand before they really learn best practices. Tedious and error prone. So let's pretend that you've shared out 14 reports and Joe just changed departments and Joe shouldn't have access anymore. Now, granted, there are APIs to do it, but most users are going to go in all the 14 reports. And do they know for sure which 14 reports are to be touched, right? So you see the risk. And watch out for just getting in the habit of usually assigning permissions to users, individuals versus groups. So back to the use groups when it's practical. Watch out for that default people in your organization sharing link. Disable it. In the tenant setting, there is an API to find widely shared artifacts. So there is an API that admins can run. There is somebody at the first Q&A that asked about finding what people have access to. So in our second Q&A, I'm going to point you to some APIs. This is one of them. So an admin would be able to find who's done this and is it okay or do we need to scale it back? Watch out for too much reshare going on. Watch out for allowing build on the underlying data set if it really isn't necessary for report consumers. Remember, build is for report creators. And then the extensive sharing from personal workspaces. All right, so request access workflow. What happens most of the time if user one wants to share something with user two? Well, most of the time, what they're going to do is they're going to run the report, copy and paste the URL, and then send it in an email, send it in a chat message, whatever, right? So Microsoft's telemetry says that is overwhelmingly the most common way that people share with each other is by sending that URL. So what happens when user two doesn't have permissions? Well, it starts what we call the request access workflow. And so what happens is they discover, I don't have permission to that. And in certain cases, they can submit a form to request access that can be approved or declined. So let me show you what that looks like and when we can use it. All right, so I'm going to go to, I'm logged into this window as a different user. I'm using a profile inside of here. So we're logged in here as Scotty, and somebody sent Scotty this URL. And it's going to think for a minute, and it's going to determine that, don't have permission. All right, request access, let's get you permission to view this report. Your first clue, by the way, is that per item permissions are happening here. So hold that thought. We're still in a Scotty, so Scotty's going to add a little message about, Sadie told me about this, I want it, etc. So I am going to go back over here, and I would also have an email, but we are going to look at it if I go to the manage permissions, and we're going to go under pending. Let my page refresh so it can pick up that pending request that just came in. Very speedy refresh, I see. Here is my pending request, and we can see that this user, we see the message way over here, and if I click the radio button, that will light up these buttons to approve or decline. So that's a valid thing to do, right? The big downside is that this person is approving access for just this report. So we'll come back to that thought here in just a second. Now, the other thing that can be done, if I pop over here to apps, and I already teed this one up. So let's say somebody sent Scotty a link to the executive bonuses app. You think we carefully manage permissions to who gets to see executive bonuses? Yeah, absolutely. So this also has a pending request area. The little thing that's a little bit different here is that in order to be able to approve or decline it, you would have to choose the audience. So here, this one only has one audience, but if we had multiple audiences, we would see that here. So the other thing that exists is custom instructions for requesting access. And so let me pop back over here for a moment. And if I go to say, we're going to do this in the data discovery session, but if I'm doing things out of order, this is my bad. Let me just show you in the data set. My bad for jumping around. If I go to this data set and I look at its settings, there is a request access setting. So what would happen here, instead of actually initiating the request access workflow like we just saw for the report and the last half of the workflow for the app, is just this little message would pop up. This kind of thing does not exist for reports and apps right now. It does exist for data sets and data marts. So I'm hoping that at some point, kind of all of these capabilities will catch up and at least be consistent. But if you do have internal requirements for getting access to the actual data, so for instance, maybe you need to track the access requests that go into for certain data sets, you can do that, or you just have an existing workflow, or maybe a two-tiered approval. Anything like that is when you want to look at this. It's just unfortunately only permitted for the data layer at the moment. So watch out for when people request access, it's for most of the individual items or the apps. And that means, unfortunately, because of how that workflow works, per item permissions end up maybe being overused. If someone got sent a URL for a workspace, there's no workflow there. They just get a, sorry, you don't have access message. Very unfriendly. So that's another reason why we would say we only want to use the workspace for those small, informal content distribution scenarios, right? People that work closely together. Once you get into the broader content distribution scenarios and people in other departments that you don't even know, perhaps, That's where the app permissions, the experience is just way, way, way nicer than this. If you did have an internal process, like you have to fill out this form to get access to a data set, the person receiving that access request and looking at that pending request will need to know, in Power BI, decline it, and instead go add them to the group or whatever the extra process is. So it's a training issue if you want to jump around the default behavior. So you can kind of use the workflow, the first half of it fine, and then satisfy the request in a better or different way if you were to decline it and then go do something else. We talked about the data sets and the data flows with their custom, and that that's our only way to send users to a form currently. All right, so now that we've talked about per item report permissions and the request access workflow, now we can tack on data sets, because we know that we need permission for both. So this is depicting one of the best patterns that you can follow. So if you've heard of a golden data set and thin reports, that's what this is. So here I've got one shared data set here at the top, and it's being used in various different ways. A Power BI report, a paginated report, an Excel report. Here's our Analyze in Excel that someone asked about. Here is a direct query composite model that is building another data set and then reports off of it. So this is essentially a hub and spoke method. And the idea here is reusing a data set for many reports and many purposes. And as we start to think about assigning permissions at the report layer and the data set layer, we can start to think about how much simpler it is to manage permissions for the data sets when there are fewer data sets. So as a quick aside, if most of the time you're creating a new data set every single time you publish a report, and then you've got a whole bunch of data sets that are basically the same, that is not scalable, right? And it gets very miserable to maintain. The risk of things being inconsistent grows. You get the idea. So this is a great pattern to follow. Doesn't need to be everything, right? But there's a lot of things that this can be done with. So that means as we start to think about our multiple layers of permissions, we know that we've got the visuals and we know that we've got the data set. So the data set has 4 levels of permission. So remember, for the report, we said we only have read and reshare. So data sets have more permissions to be concerned with. So the read permission, just like you would expect, is targeted to our report consumers. So we would need that in order to read any of the reports that are built on top of this data set. Build is targeted towards report creators. So meaning I want to build new reports based on this data set. The write permission is targeted towards data set creators. So I get to write or manage this data set. For instance, it needs a new measure. So who's going to go in and add the new measure and republish the data set? That's what the write permission is all about. It comes right along with contributor, member, admin, workspace roles, or there's this fairly new write permission that is at the individual data set level. This was released a few months ago, and it's one of those things that Azure Analysis Services has had for a long time. And if you've noticed that Power BI has been trying to catch up, especially Power BI Premium, but they've been trying to close a lot of the feature gaps. And a write permission for the actual model was just a feature gap. So that one's closed. Finally, reshare. is same exact idea for the reports, just at the data set level. So now we get into a little bit of an interesting concept about the links versus direct access. The two different types exist for data sets as well, but they behave differently a little bit than what we talked about for the reports. So let's say we create a link for a report, and that link's going to work for the data set as well. We're going to see this in a demo in a second. If I change that link for the report, it will also change for the data set. So you can think about the links as being tightly coupled. However, if we do direct access and we say read permission for a report, and it gets added for the data set as well, it doesn't have to stay tightly coupled. You can remove read access from the report level and leave it at the data set level. And that's actually important functionality when you start doing this. So I think of that as tightly coupled versus not tightly coupled. All right, so before we look at this, a couple more concepts. We talked about this a little bit earlier. So we've got our data workspace and our report workspace. So our data authors get the workspace role or the dataset write permission. Now, I have talked to people that really like to keep a lot of data sets in, say, one workspace. And even though I don't love that pattern, if they manage it well, go for it. That's when the dataset write permission would become really important, is because they want to store a bunch of data sets in one data workspace. Then our report authors, they get the build on the data set and they get the workspace role. So we talked about that earlier, just kind of wanted to circle back around now that we're knee deep into our data sets conversation. So let's talk a little bit more about the links. So I'm going to go to my sales data set. Notice that I'm going to hover on a report. The report here has a sharing icon, right? If I hover on a data set, there is no sharing icon. We have to go after it under the Manage Permissions menu. Okay, actually, hang on. I'm going to do call center data instead. All right, so here's all my direct access for this particular data set. And here are some existing links. Now, these were created when someone created a link on a report that uses this data set. So I want you to notice that up here at the top of links, there's no add link. Remember, we did that over when we were looking at a report. We can't do it for the data set. So these are all at the data set level, all inherited from the report and all tightly coupled. I cannot create one from here. So if I go back to Sales Analytics, and I'm going to go to my call center stats report. Yes. And go to manage permissions for it. So just to be clear, so you know where I'm at, I'm in a reporting workspace now for my call center stats report. And if I go back to my other window I was just at, that's call center data in a sales data workspace. Okay. So under links, here are the same two links. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to notice that the first one is 3 people, read, reshare. And the second one is 2 people, read. So how about if I'm going to go ahead and just delete this second link just for fun. Okay. Now, if I go back over here to this other page, what do we say about the dataset links? Tightly coupled. As soon as this page refreshes, it's gone. So that's a very different experience, though, than direct access. So I'm going to go back to the report. I'm going to go to direct access. And I'm going to go ahead and add a user here. Again, I'm on the report. So before I do this, let me pop back over to the data set, go to direct access. I got some inherited stuff, but notice that Griffin is no longer, I'm sorry, he's not on this page at all. So I'm going to add him over here on the report. Build is fine, reshare is fine. For this purpose, I don't care. We're going to say okay. So Griffin now has direct access on the report because it's also required on the data set. That's going to be added here. And this was added as a convenience, essentially. So he might actually be a member in one of these other groups. The system doesn't know. It just adds this as a correlating side effect from the report to make sure that you share a report, they can actually get what they need. So he's got read, reshare, and build. Now, I could change this over here because when we say this is not tightly coupled. So if I go back to the report side where this started, and I go ahead and I'm going to remove that. Here's where if I do not check this, I'm going to remove this access. I did not check to remove it from the data set as well. That's where his access is going to stay for the data set. Same exact experience if you add someone to an app audience. They get added to the data set. You remove them from the app audience. They still have access to the data set. So you want to get in the habit of auditing and managing your data set permissions independently. Because all this stuff can be added by convenience. But whether or not it's actually tightly coupled and actually current now is a whole nother thing. All right, so the build permission is actually a really powerful permission. And someone asked about this earlier. It allows you to create a new report from that data set. It allows you to create a composite model. So that would be, I'm connecting in direct query mode, and I'm adding other data sources as well, creating a composite model. So that's not the same as live connection. Conceptually, yes, but different technically under the covers. And so that's that direct query for Power BI data sets functionality. This is also how you get to use Analyze in Excel, which is kind of conceptually similar to creating a new Power BI report, right? You're just creating a new report in Excel that is connected to that data set. And incidentally, if you have people that love Excel and they're doing a lot of Excel exports, Analyze in Excel, it's basically a live connection to the data set. They can be happy, they can stay in Excel, but you're not duplicating the data, you're not exporting the data. So it kind of is a win-win in that respect. And this also, if you are on premium capacity or PPU, lets you send queries through the XMLA endpoint. So if you want to use another tool, that kind of stuff. So build is a very powerful permission on the data set. Again, one of those things that I think should be audited and managed and not just, handed out willy-nilly. Now, there's also this concept of external sharing of data sets. And this is all about, I want to share data with guest users in another tenant. And this was initially released and they called it cross-tenant data set sharing. Now they're calling it in-place data set sharing. And some places it's just called external sharing. All the same thing. So the idea here is, let's say you've got this sales data set, and you know that you have customers or vendors or consultants or whatever, that they want to be able to take your data and they want to work over in their own tenant. And so you basically give them permission to create a new direct query composite model. It would exist in their tenant, and it uses your data as a data source. And in this situation, the lingo is you're the provider, they're the consumer. That means consumer is now a very overloaded term. Usually we use the term consumer to say these are our view-only readers, right? They only consume or view reports. Once they introduced this functionality, now, it's like they're the consumer of the data, but it really is report creators, right? And data model creators that are accessing it. So overloading the term. You need the build permissions for the external users to be able to do this. There's also an external sharing data set setting. So if I go to any data set and I go to its settings, assuming this person is allowed to flip this on from the tenant settings. So it kind of already has to be, the door open from the admin side. Then whoever owns and manages the data set has to say on an individual data set level, this is allowed. So data sets, to kind of wrap up this piece, things to watch out for. Build and write are enabled by default when granting data set permissions. So people need to be taught what's really necessary, right? Because a lot of times if you just click, click, click and run through this fast, it might be more than you need. And, Power BI wants to make things as easy as possible for people. Less friction, less frustration. And I can respect that. I do get it. But when we're talking about security and sensitive data, we want to think about what we're doing. Granting the build permission can be done while you're sharing a report or while you're publishing an app. But here's the thing. How often are your consumers and creators the exact same group of people? So your viewers of the app, every single one of them really needs to create new content. And maybe you have no concern with that particular data set about too many build permissions. That's okay. But when you got more sensitive data, that's when you really got to start thinking about what are the needs of those folks. Get in the habit of really thinking about data set permissions separately from report permissions, and somebody in your organization really needs to be auditing this kind of stuff. The Power BI implementation planning guidance that I've pointed to a couple times, I have just finished writing all of the auditing and monitoring content. So we're going to have a ton of stuff drop in not that long. It needs to get through the review process. So that'll take a little while, but got a ton of stuff coming on that front. And if I give you a little teaser for what's to come, so not only will there be a whole new section here for, auditing and monitoring will be its own section. What we're going to do is circle back. I'm really excited about this. So like these workspaces content that's already here, there will then be a new fourth article added, workspace auditing, right? And then at the end of the security content, there will be a new one at the end, security auditing, right? So we had to get the first one out, or the first set, and then we can start coming back and adding to some of these others. And I'm really excited. All right, couple quick data mart things. We're not talking about data marts very much today, but I want to give you a heads up, because when they say sharing a data mart. That has taken the term sharing and represents something different than it's ever been in Power BI before. So sharing represents, for a data mart, both read and build. And usually build is optional, but sharing just includes both for a data mart. So kind of watch out for that. And it grants not only being able to access the data set in the data mart, but also the SQL endpoint. So the Azure SQL database that exists behind the scenes. And sharing a data mart is always direct access. It doesn't create sharing links. So that one also is a little bit different in terms of its default behavior. There's also some roles that get mapped to that Azure SQL database. You can't manage them from the database side, though. It'll be interesting to see kind of how that changes over time. All right, data discovery. Let me do a quick time check and see where I'm at. So one moment here, because I do see that we're a tiny bit behind. Oh, yeah, I'm a lot behind. So I'm going to speed up. So data discovery. So I've said how this is a really good pattern to follow, right? You've got report creators. How do they know that a data set exists? And that's the whole goal behind data discovery. So what could they do? Maybe they ask a colleague. Maybe they search in Power BI. But here's the thing. You use that search bar at the top. You need permissions for it to show up. So you can't discover something that you don't already have permissions to. So that doesn't really work. We've got the true discovery experience in Power BI, meaning I'm going to get to see metadata. I'm going to get to see this thing exists. Or we've got a data catalog like the Purview data catalog. So in Power BI at the moment, the data discovery experience is oriented around this data hub, and it's focused on data sets and data marts. And so if I were to go to the settings for, say, this particular data set under endorsement and discovery, assuming that content is endorsed, which means it's either promoted or certified, which is a whole nother conversation about that. Assuming it's one of the other, we can make it discoverable. And that's what would expose the metadata so that somebody is able to see that this thing exists. So if I go back over to Scotty's window and we look at his workspaces, you see he's only got a couple workspaces he has access to. So Data Hub, come on, nice and slow. What we're going to see when this screen populates is that he will see the existence of the sales data set. But when we hover on it, there is this little person icon, and it is request access to work with this data set. And remember how we talked before in the request access workflow that if we want to, for data sets, we could use a form, well, this message that tells people to go to such and such form. We could use that instead of the built-in workflow. So you can kind of decide which one is appropriate. So a lot of these he does not directly have access to, but he can see that they actually exist. And so that's a really helpful thing in when you're trying to reuse existing data sets. Very, very good pattern. I've got another presentation on my presentations page called something like Increasing Trustworthiness of Power BI Content, where I talk more about things like certified content and data discovery and that kind of thing. All right, let's have a quick RLS discussion. So the fundamental question is, what data are users allowed to see? And if we import that data, we got to get it from the source, we got to run a refresh schedule, and then this data set contains the data that people see on the report. Or if we're in direct query mode, it comes straight from the source data. But how do we know what people are allowed to see? And that's actually kind of a complicated question, because first it involves credentials. So if somebody leaves the organization, for instance, you might have an issue with, it was using his user credentials. Now that it's disabled, the refresh fails. That's a very common thing. Could also be a database user that was just granted, in which case it would continue to work because it's this other thing, or a key, right? And it could be the data set owner, or it could be someone else, like a service account that was assigned, right? So lots of options there for the credentials. And then the question is, where are those credentials being stored? Inside the data set? If it's reaching into a gateway, then it's getting it from that data source. Or if you're reaching into the source system, you should be using single sign-on. So there's all these different pieces to the puzzle. What if we want to show different data to different people based on their identity? So that's where row-level security and object-level security comes into play. So the idea is, let's pretend for this same model, one set of people gets to see US data and another people get to see the European data. That can be done with row-level security because we are showing them different rows of data. So different sets of customers, different regions, different employees, etc. There's also object-level security, and that's more about columns. So a good example there would be, these people get to see gross profit. These other people don't get to see gross profit because that's sensitive calculation, for instance. There's not currently a user interface in Power BI Desktop to define object-level security, so you can do it in something like Tabular Editor. So this isn't used quite as often as row-level security. So here's the thing that I want you to remember is that, and I really speak mostly just to RLS here, even though people think about it's impacting what's shown on a report, it's implemented on the data set. So it gets really confusing because people think it's report security, and it's really implemented at the data set level. So back a few minutes ago when I said to start thinking about reusing data sets in a shared data set, as soon as you start going down the road of row-level security, that makes it even more important to not have a bunch of duplicate data sets. And only applicable to viewers. Anybody with edit permissions on that data set, RLS is just ignored, and that is by design. Fundamentally, what happens is we define a role, we define some rules, and we map people to the rules. So in the time, I'm going to move through this really fast. The big thing that I just want you to know, because you can go figure out RLS from a whole bunch of different online resources, the presence of RLS in a model fundamentally changes the default experience for users. And let me explain what I mean by that. So let's say we start in Power BI Desktop. We have data set 1, okay? We do not have any RLS roles on that data set at all. So what that means is viewers of that data set see all of the data in the data set because it's not restricting. There is no row-level security. So that should make intuitive sense. If you expected it to be opposite, right, that they see nothing, hold tight. Data set 2 contains at least one role. That's where the default behavior changes and they see nothing in data set 2 unless they are in one or more roles. So before, when I said RLS is like a second level of defense for bad security, right? You got too many reports that people can see. It's not a good user experience, but this is what I meant, the existence of one or more roles. Now, that's for consumers, the people that are workspace viewers or data set read permissions. As soon as you get workspace contributor member admin, or you have right on the data set, you always see all of the data regardless of this. And that's because you can edit the data set. So it's not narrowing down the results for you at all. So watch out for it's ignored in Power BI desktop, right? Because once you're in desktop, of course, you can edit the model because you're in desktop. It's ignored in the service in those situations, like I just mentioned. Try to keep your roles the same as who you've given permission to read the reports and the data sets, right? Because when there's a mismatch, it's a lesser experience, right? People get confused, but it is a good second level of defense if you have concerns there. We're not talking about static versus dynamic rules, but static rules are super simple to implement. They're also very limiting in what you can do. So look into this idea of dynamic rules and data-driven rules if in fact you're like, ooh, this is not doing what I want. It can get a little bit more complicated pretty fast, but there are the couple different ways that you can implement it. And one really interesting thing that you can do to not have to rewrite a lot of stuff is you can start putting some of the rules in like a data flow, for instance, that then different data set users can go and grab the mapping table, things like that, so that you make it easier for others to reuse one existing set of rules. All right, let me wrap up with just a few thoughts, and then we will open it up to the final set of questions. We talked at the beginning about the multiple layers of security. So whenever you can, right, the collection of items is a really good idea. We've got per item, and then we've got the other stuff, right? I didn't list them all here, but think about your layers of security when you're doing some planning. Think about creators versus consumers. So on the left, give people who are creating content workspace permissions. Give people who are consuming content app permissions. And this is just a rule of thumb, right? Just your place to start mentally and then say, well, in my situation, I want to do it differently because. So this is just a really good starting point. My preference for you, your mental starting point would be first to say, can I use a Power BI app for permissions? Because it's the best experience for users, right? We didn't really look at an app, but it's got the nice menu, all that kind of stuff. Number two, workspace viewer permissions. It's really only suitable for small teams and such. Third is the per item sharing. And again, a lot of times that ends up being first for people, and especially because that built-in workflow really gears people towards this. But since it's like an exception, if you're making a decision, I would like for you to consider it last rather than first. We're not really talking about admins here, but I want to just make a couple quick mentions. And one is your administrators can, in the admin portal, update and delete workspace roles in the entire tenant. So that executive bonuses workspace, your Power BI admin can absolutely go in and add themselves or someone else to that workspace. So that is a very high privilege role. They can now access personal workspaces. It's time boxed for 24 hours, but it's possible now. They can access all of the APIs, all of the admin APIs, and all of the tenant-wide metadata to see, all the activity that's happening, et cetera. They can manage all the tenant settings, which wildly influences the user experience. So even though this wasn't really the focus security-wise, I wanted to at least leave that message with you. Don't forget data that's stored outside of the service, right? So we talked solely today about what's sitting inside the service, right? But we've got our source files, we've got our exports, we've got embedding, right? There's all kinds of stuff. So if you're trying to come up with how should we do security, think about it from an end-to-end perspective. And that Power BI implementation planning guidance will also mention that in there as well. And so kind of the last statement that I'll leave you is, and Matthew Roche would be so proud, is, what's your data culture? And what I mean by that is securing data really is everyone's responsibility. So if someone asks for access to this report or that data set, how do we figure out how we can say yes? So yes, and the requirement is this and this and this, rather than saying no. So back to that whole value, being able to access the data as much as we value protecting the data and, equally respecting both of them, which is so much easier for me to say than it is for you to make happen on a day-to-day basis in the real world. Okay, so that is everything that I had prepared. Let me circle back quickly to one thing that came up in the first Q&A, and that is the question came up, how do I know who has access to what? And I believe that this came up because it is not any fun to go in and open up every single workspace and look at the workspace settings, et cetera, et cetera. And even if an administrator wanted to do that, they would have to grant themselves access to do that. So I want to point out that there are a set of admin APIs. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go through and I'm going to share with you some of the most common APIs that you would want to do. And the activity events are one of them. All of the events like who updated workspace roles, who shared a report, et cetera, et cetera. All of those security events are logged. To my knowledge, unless it's changed recently though, sharing a report is logged, unsharing a report is not. I hope that gets fixed one of these days. Couple that with, by the way, getting your tenant inventory, and that would include all of these, what they call the scanner APIs. And so you can get all of your users there too. So if you capture a snapshot of that kind of data, say once a week, you can always couple the activities with the snapshot of what do permissions look like today, and then you can always back into what the full picture is. A few of the other APIs that you'll need, this get user artifact access as admin. This only gives you like report shares and dashboard shares, the per item. It's not a full 365 look at a user. So this is one piece of the puzzle. Get group users as admin. This is basically tell me all of my workspace roles. This one is golden. This is a little bit easier to get to than the scanner APIs that I mentioned a minute ago. But if you've got a massive, massive, massive tenant, you'll need to look at the scanner APIs. So this one, get group users as admin. This is your workspaces. Group is still in the name because workspaces used to be called groups because of how they originated. So as not to break the API, it still has the legacy name. Here is the same thing just for, so get all of my app permissions. Again, these are all point in time snapshots. So you'd need to pull them once a week, once a month. You got get report users. Same thing exists for get dataset users, et cetera. There's a handful of them like this. Here is the one to find the widely shared, the links to the whole organization. This will tell you the people that have used that. And then there's one that is a who's used publish to web, which means the report is out there on the public internet. So as we proceed with the Power BI implementation auditing stuff, all of this will be compiled in a much easier to understand way, but that's it's no small feat to get started doing security auditing. All right, Mark, Mikhail.
Yes, we have a bunch of questions. So first question is workspace roles.
Yes.
A member role can add lower roles, contributor and viewer, but cannot change or remove. Only admin can do that. Is there a reason why? It would be more efficient if members could maintain lower roles.
I don't have a good answer for what the reasoning is. So that would be kind of nice if that was like here we say contributor can have this one extra thing if it's allowed in the workspace. That would be kind of nice if remove could be added for the members and you didn't have to get involved in admin. I guess the question would be for like what the blocker is for letting one or two members be admins. Granted, that does, grant them this too.
So next question, Francisco says, assuming you have hundreds of workspaces and thousands of reports, how do you make sure that personally identifiable information is secured and all the right people get access to these reports? How do you govern that kind of sensitive data and spot those reports?
Yeah, that's difficult. What I would look into is under information protection, you've got the DLP for Power BI. So that's the thing where we can tell it, here's certain information types. I want you to search my data sets and tell me when that information type exists. So a couple things here. One is it only works for premium. I hate it when data loss prevention stuff isn't just open to everybody. But two, you have to give it, it's basically, think of it as a regex pattern, so regular expressions. So you got to give it something it can find. And so things like customer names, I'd have to look and see if you can define these are names, right? It can find addresses, right? It can find phone numbers. So not quite sure how sensitive of data you're looking at, but there are a bunch of built-in sensitive information types. And then you can also custom define some as well to hopefully get at what you're looking at. So look at, it's literally called DLP for Power BI and see if that'll work for you.
Perfect. So hopefully this is a nice, easy question for you. Anthony asks, what dataset permissions do you need for? Number 1, export to Excel. Number 2, analyze in Excel.
Analyze in Excel, you need read plus build. Export to Excel, I would have to check if that is read by itself. Both of them, my answer is also qualified by making sure that you can do so via the tenant setting. But I would have to check myself on the export if that is read alone or read plus build.
I mean, just off that question then, is there a quite useful security matrix that an idiot like myself, for instance, could go and look for those kind of permissions?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I have seen a couple people online create stuff, but I don't have a beautiful one to hand off. And we actually talked about a little bit creating something like that when we put together this security content. And, we did do, if I go down here, we did do a little bit, but it's more like you need to create new content. What might you need? Or you need to publish content. What might you need? It's not quite what you're looking at. And we ended up kind of deciding that some of that nitty-gritty reference data would go in what we call core docs. So where I play at for publishing, this is all called Power BI guidance documentation. And so if you think about it, this is the the what and the why, right? And what we try not to do is repeat too much the detailed product how, and that's what we call core documentation for, oh, this screen has 4 settings and all that kind of stuff. So long answer is I don't know of a beautiful resource to point you to.
We have a couple of comments about that. Vikrant says export to Excel, read works. And Megan says export to Excel could depend on settings on the report. If the report creator sets it to none or summarize data, and also your data layout.
Fair point on the layout, and fair point on some of the report settings for, yeah. So let me just pull up a quick, yeah.
Yes, how do you tell automatically for each app which reports people have access to when multiple audiences are used? Francisco has tried, and the Power BI REST API give you the users for the whole app.
Yeah, I agree. So audiences, I believe, might still be in preview. I am not 100% certain if those have hit general availability yet as a feature. But as of just a week or two ago, a couple of us were complaining and saying, yes, we want to get that detailed audience info out of the API. And you're right, it's just not there yet. I agree, but it's bound to come soon.
Perfect.
Let's go on to the next question. So, not sure if I'm pronouncing this right. Adelau asks, is there an overview chart for admin users to view all security permissions? Now that would be good.
Yeah, the best thing that I have is if we go back towards the beginning, I've got this downloadable on my website. So this is trying to basically say the type of object. So here, the blue box is the workspace as a whole, and you'd be able to set admin member, contributor, reviewer, right? And then, okay, for a report, you've got read, reshare, sensitivity label, which is not security per se, but, it's got some hooks into it. So this is the overview chart that I have. And then here's the correlating one for what administrators would manage. And with my asterisk on this one, I haven't double checked in about 3 months that something new hasn't snuck in. So with that caveat.
Cool.
Good. We have a person asking, what does Purview bring compared to what the API REST API in Power BI gives us, the monitoring and admin APIs?
Yeah, so that's a really big question. And I say that because everything in Microsoft 365 from a compliance perspective and auditing. So like even the unified audit log, where our activity log starts from, right? That's also under the Purview umbrella. So anything Microsoft 365 security and compliance now is there. So that means all of this information protection and data loss prevention is considered Purview, okay? Depending on where you do some stuff for security groups and stuff, right? Azure AD, some of it's done over in Microsoft 365, right? So the lines are getting blurred there. There's also the Purview data catalog. And so that's not so much security related. That's more about getting an inventory of what's in your tenant and seeing it over on the Purview side. So there's huge number of hooks into Purview now because they've rebranded practically everything as Purview. So I think in the beginning of this article, I tried to say the features and services most pertinent for this, at least the information protection and data loss prevention, are these, because there's a bazillion things now. So Microsoft gets to say that they have however many millions of users using Purview now because of all the stuff being rebranded. That's me being cynical. I think they rebranded too much and it's way too confusing.
Perfect. Mark, do you do the honors of the final question?
Yeah, well, this could be a nice simple one. So let's give it a go. Does row level security work for paginated reports as well?
Yes, because it's implemented on the data set. And regardless of how you access that data set, RLS is then invoked once it's there.
Great. So that was the last question. And big thanks to everybody for joining us, and a special thanks to Melissa.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to get this recording out behind the only other time I've done this was for a conference. So it's behind a paywall just for a small number of people. So I'm excited to get it out there. So thank you for doing that for me. I appreciate it, guys.
Our pleasure.